Greetings friends, my name is Pavel Stelmach and now we will dive into the top news of this day. Russia continues its terror. The entire entrance of the resident building was destroyed in Uman. At least 16 people died, 17 more were injured, but the rubble is still being cleared and will continue throughout the night. Among the dead in Uman are two 10-year-old children. The head of the Cherkasy Regional Military Administration reported the cynical Russian struck at 4 a.m. when all the residents were sleeping peacefully in their homes.
Last night, the enemy attacked Ukraine again with missiles and UAVs. Terrorists targeted civilians and objects. A rocket attack on Uman damaged about 10 apartment buildings. The entire block of one of them was destroyed. People are still trapped under the rubble. Unfortunately, there are casualties, including a child. In Dnipro, terrorist shelling claimed the life of a child. My condolences to everyone who lost their loved ones because of the Russian terror. I'm grateful to our air forces, our anti-aircraft gunners, everyone who helps overcome the consequences of enemy attacks, everyone who protects our people. This Russian terror must face a fair response from Ukraine and the world, and it will. Every such attack, every evil act against our country and people bring the terrorist state closer to failure and punishment, not vice versa as they think. We will not forget any crime. We will not let any invader avoid responsibility. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, on Facebook.
The Russian mass media are talking one in front of the other about the fact that the cause of their destruction is the work of the Ukrainian Air Defense Forces. But the Ministry of Defense of Russia, which is better called the Ministry of War, published this picture on social networks this morning. This is the launcher from which the rockets were launched and the inscription exactly on target. Today's target were Uman and Dnipro. According to the head of the Regional Military Administration, Russian rockets killed a young woman and a 2-year-old girl. 3 people were injured. As a result of rocket fire, a residential building and a hangar were destroyed. An apartment building in Ukrainka, a town near Kyiv, was also damaged. 2 people were injured there, including a 13-year-old girl.
Russia's reckless drone and missile strikes against Ukraine's population are carried out on a daily basis, especially by targeting civilians, civilian infrastructure such as housing or residential areas, mostly in the frontline areas. And just to illustrate the barbarity and the inhuman nature of the Russian actions, this is a piece of shrapnel from a bomb heavy of 500 kilograms. This is one of those which are being dropped on civilian targets in Ukraine. This one was collected from the ruins of a school by children. Children are collecting these, making such key rings just to show what is flying around after every explosion Russia is causing in Ukraine. The Russian attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure constitute war crimes.
I will just add another crime. I don't know what the exact goals were for this strike. After all, these are no longer blows to the energy infrastructure. So where? To civilians. This is terrorism, and I suspect that this has been done to raise the stress level of ordinary citizens of Ukraine. This is done to detect and exhaust our air defense and missile defense systems. Probably the Kremlin believes that in this way they will force us to sit down at the negotiating table. But no, we will not sit down, because they do not negotiate with terrorists and criminals. They are judged and punished. The Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Alexei Reznikov, said that the equipment announced by the partners for the Ukrainian forces has been partially delivered. With some types of weapons, the military is completing training programs. The minister reminded that Ukraine, in addition to the tank coalition, where the Leopard 2 plus Challenger tanks will primarily enter, and the Leopard 1 will arrive a little later, is waiting for the Abrams. However, as Reznikov explained, American tanks will not take part in the upcoming counteroffensive, but our crews went to training.
We also have many armored vehicles of various types, particularly armored personal carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. We have Bradleys, Marders, Strikers and CV-90s from Sweden. We are finishing up some more training courses there. In a global sense, we are ready. The next question is for the general staff for the command. As soon as we have God's will, the weather and the decision of the commanders, we will do it. Alexei Reznikov, Minister of Defense of Ukraine.
We will do it. This is a counterattack. However, you shouldn't have high hopes for it, because the higher the hopes, the greater the disappointment if they don't all come true. The situation on the front lines might appear to be stalled right now, despite the ongoing fierce fighting. However, this is only a transitional state between Russia's largely failed winter offensive and the series of counteroffensive operations by Ukraine. Yes, precisely operations, because no one forbids making many small attacks instead of one big one. The media talk a lot about Ukraine's next military move and sometimes make it sound like a decisive battle. But it is more accurate to say that our war effort is a series of operations in different places along the front line. There could be pauses between them, just like there was a break between the lightning-fast operation of the Kharkiv region in September, which took only 6 days, and the more gradual deoccupation of Kherson, which ended on November 11th. The scope and methods of upcoming operations will also be different. Even though they are spread out over time and space, they are all united by a single objective, and that is the complete restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We encourage partners to view the upcoming counteroffensive as a process with distinct stages rather than a single decisive battle that will determine the war's outcome. Russia wants to destroy us. Either we tame it by putting it behind bars, the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, or it will destroy us. Either we shoot it, or we get shot.
Світ знає, Росію можна зупинити.
The world also knows that Russia can be stopped. This is a common interest, stopped by the might of our warriors on the front line, by our weapons, both Ukrainian and those we receive from our partners, by the power of law, that is, sanctions that need to be constantly enhanced, and by our joint work for justice. Every manifestation of Russian terror, every day of aggression is an additional argument that all this must end in the tribunal, in a new Nuremberg against racism, against those who destroy lives and people, who use missiles against museums and guided bombs against churches. Russia must lose. The world cannot have any other goal, for anything else is a defeat of life, a defeat of law, a defeat of the world itself.
The truth is that the defeat of Russia means no more life for Europe and the rest of the world. There is no more important task for us alive today. To fulfill this task effectively, we need more weapons and ammunition, and we need everything to arrive as soon as possible. The war unleashed by Russia has attracted the attention of many researchers to the problem of the transformation of post-Soviet societies. It became obvious how the paths of development of the two countries diverged: the dominance of the oligarchy and dictatorship in the Russian Federation and the emerging democracy and civil society in Ukraine. For example, Janine Vedel, who has studied Ukraine in Russia since the early 1990s, has traced the rise of oligarchy capitalism in Russia and Ukraine over the past 30 years. In her report, she contrasts this process with the development of Ukrainian civil society, which took place in the same period and turned out to be a counterweight to corruption and oligarchic influence. Janine Vedel's concept is that in modern society there are two competing and equally strong directions of development, which are called oligarchy capitalism and civil society. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has clearly exacerbated the confrontation between these two forms. Moreover, in my opinion, Putin's confidence in the weakness of Europe and Western unity was one of the important factors in deciding to attack Ukraine.
I contend that oligarchy capitalism has compromised our commitment to the principles of our political, financial, civic, and educational institutions, the integrity of liberal democracy. Janine Vedel, anthropologist, professor.
If in Ukraine civil society has accelerated its formation on the basis of the joint organization of the Ukrainian people to resist the invaders, then Putin's oligarchy in Russia either supported the actions of the state or silently endured sanctions and the freezing of its assets in the West. And due to the fact that the Russian government has started a war against Ukraine and the sanctions pressure will only increase, it will only become more difficult for Russian entrepreneurs and companies over time, even despite the fact that, for example, there is a huge lobby in Europe.
But in the Council, among member states, you still have countries opposing it. So we have to overcome their opposition. And the same thing happens, for instance, for diamonds. How do you explain diamonds are out of sanction regime from EU? Diamonds. I mean, is it like bread that people would go to the streets if the price of diamonds is up because of Russian diamonds being cut from the European market? No, diamonds is only for a small minority of Europeans, you know. And still we have diamonds excluded because Belgium was active to exclude diamonds. So that should come to an end. Really, that should come to an end after all these months plural of discussion. It's over. We should not have exemptions, sectorial exemptions to our sanctions. And of course, it's about helping Ukraine, it's about sanctioning Putin's regime, it's also about being just coherent with what we say. If we say that we need to defeat Putin's regime in Ukraine, that we need Putin to lose, then we need also to make sure that we are stopping any form of financing of Putin's regime, including with diamonds or with Rosatom or with nuclear products.
According to Janine Wedel, the whole world should look closely at the processes that occur due to oligarchic influence, as it demonstrates what can happen with any democracy and economic system. The expert spent about a year in Ukraine and found that unlike Russians, Ukrainians have a history of shared public space. We also talked with Dr. Asina Small, an economist and data scientist at the University of Virginia. Among other things, we also asked why some Western companies continue to work there, despite the fact that Russia is an aggressor country. Here is the response we received.
Russian financial institutions that are allowed to operate in international markets. There are still American companies that are operating in, and other Western companies that are operating in Russia. When the United States was dealing with North Korea, when it was dealing with Cuba, there was no messing around, if you will. There was no hedging. They would just say, you cannot do business in the United States and North Korea at the same time. You have to pick one market or the other. This is the attitude that we should be taking towards Russia, I believe.
Full interview with Dr. Small you can see on this Sunday's wrap-up. There are many interesting things. In the meantime, the Ukrainian civil society, which has accelerated its formation on the basis of the joint organization of the Ukrainian people to resist the occupiers, will also improve, because we do not have time for a long transformation. We already want to be in the EU and NATO. That concludes our today's video. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for future videos. Goodbye.